Conservation Program and Environment at the Toronto Zoo, overseeing the zoo's movement towards carbon neutral operations. She focuses on zoo operations to meet their Green Plan objectives by 2027, implementing renewable energy projects, resources, conservation practices, and employee and visitor engagement in sustainability. Kyla is currently working on her PhD in invasive species ecology and climate resiliency at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. During this session, Kyla will lead you on a virtual tour of how, sorry, just a minute, on a virtual tour of how the zoo is reducing its ecological footprint to help protect wildlife and wild spaces. Tyler Tabobondang is a member of the Beaver clan from Wasauksing First Nation and has been working as a conservation steward for the Toronto Zoo since 2017. Through the Turtle Island Conservation Program, Tyler works to protect Indigenous lands through the conservation of community stories and culture. During his session, Tyler will be sharing information about the programs available at the zoo, which share the lessons learned from our Indigenous partners about living more sustainably and in tune with our natural environments. Sean Blackburn is the lead developer for youth and family experiences at the zoo, including the even popular children's summer zoo camp. Sean has been trained in the Nature Start Professional Development Program supported by the Association of Zoos and Aquarium and is the lead advocate of the Toronto Zoo's Natureplay project, which has the goal of significantly increasing the play opportunities available to the zoo's guests with dedicated play space and the addition of free choice learning concepts into guest experiences. Thank you.
So Taylor, you're sharing your slide deck, right? Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and you should be able to, yeah, awesome.
Great. Does that work?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So I think Kyla is first to start.
Kyle, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Kyla.
Sorry, you're not yet in presenter mode.
Oh, my apologies. Sorry, 1 second. That is very odd. Do you see notes or do you see the presenter mode?
I see notes.
Okay, 1 second. I'm going to reshare it. My apologies. It's going into, there we go. Oh, what we're gonna do. Sorry, this happens to me a lot when I host tutorials as well. Is if we do this, that should fix the issue.
Yes, that's wonderful. Thanks, Taylor.
No problem.
So as an introduction, I deal with the zoo sustainability program, and that has two aspects to it. It's basically working with our zoo staff and volunteers in order to make the zoo more green. And then the second option is engagement. And engagement is actually for staff and volunteers, but also for the public. So how do we take the climate change message about the animals, the impacts on climate change on the animals and on our habitats, and get people engaged in activities to mitigate climate change? And the biggest and most successful way that the zoo has done it is to look at this modus loop and incorporate the modus loop, which is typical for recycling, and make it a 3-action program for sustainability. So it's using the science, interpreting the science and the actions behind that science in order to get people to understand the impacts of climate change, the actions that are causing climate change. It's getting it out into the public in forms, multiple different forms that they can understand. And then it's actually taking action at the zoo where people can see what the zoo is doing and how that actions can be taken in their own daily lives. but giving them opportunities to engage in action themselves, whether it's us setting it up for them or facilitating within the community. Next slide, Taylor. So a great example of what the zoo has done in the past in order to bring all three areas, science, awareness, and action into place is our 2019 Washed Ashore exhibit. The zoo made specific commitments itself to reducing its plastic use and its plastic activities that were being sold at the zoo in order to reduce its impact on aquatic ecosystems and the environment. But we did this in an exhibit at the zoo where people could see what is being talked about. So we worked with local researchers at the University of Toronto and York University to understand the science behind plastics in our environment, where they were coming from, the type of plastics that were out there, and where they were ending up. And we took this information, we made it into a public venue so that people could understand the actual science. And by working with local scientists, we understood the local message. So globally, we can get the information on a global scale, but we wanted to specifically address in our local community that the plastics that were being used here in Toronto did make their way to the ocean. And how did that happen? So people can understand how they are 1,600 kilometers away from the ocean, actually impacting the ocean. So we had 11 different sculptures at the zoo that was made up of plastics. And these sculptures was plastic from shoreline collections. They were created by an artist and developed by volunteers. And each one of them took a message. There were scavenger hunts in those sculptures where people can look and try and find the different type of plastics that were found in the ocean beaches. We did activities, we did engagement opportunities to try and get people to understand. Then we set up engagement in the community activities, shoreline cleanup events, and local habitat cleanup events, so people can actually see the amount of plastic. And we concentrated on everything, but we really took home the message of how much plastic that we were finding in our own local environments. And then we tied it all back together, that their actions by helping us clean up the local environment was helping, and how it connected back to the science that was coming out and how we can actually relate to the benefits to the environment. Next. So also building on this, and because that was so successful, we've really taken the engagement, conservation action, and environmental stewardship and built it into a lot of different programs at the zoo. So what you're looking at here is the nice, lovely polar bear on your right hand of the screen. That is Polly Bear. Polly Bear is the Toronto Zoo's contribution to the Washed Ashore exhibit, where she was actually made up of plastics from local shoreline cleanup activities. It also was supported by local businesses that wanted to promote what they're doing to commit to reducing plastic as well. So although the 10 sculptures that were created by an artist came from the West Coast and was specific ocean shoreline cleanup activities, we were actually able to create our own beautiful sculpture under the same format with the same scavenger hunt from local plastics. And it was unique because there's shoes in there, there's toothbrushes, there's a kettle, there's a microwave. These were things we collected in local shoreline, so people can really get the message close to home. On the left-hand side, where we have the mirage of pictures, is our Adopt a Pond and Turtle Island programs. We're working on a, oh my goodness, Taylor, what's that called? A safe passage, an eco passage, sorry, thank you. An eco passage for animals to be able to cross local roads and prevent being hit by shoreline cleanup, or sorry, by cars on the road. And this was a project that we sought funding for. This was what our staff were putting together as part of their larger scale project for protecting animals along urbanized roadways. But the area where this specific project, which was actually just near the zoo in Pickering, was very well a site of disposal by people. There was a lot of garbage in the area. And in order for our team to be successful in their eco-passage project, we needed to get people out. So the top picture is Toronto Zoo staff. The opportunity to engage our own staff in a cleanup and get them involved in volunteer, get them out of the zoo, get them engaged in the conservation projects that we were supporting. Then later on in the fall, the bottom picture there is a local shoreline cleanup that also run by our Adopt a Pond program, but actually engaged the general public. So some of our staff participated, but most of the attendants were from the general public. And I believe we had somewhere of 26 different people show up to help. So by engaging our staff to support areas of the zoo that they don't normally work in and support their projects, and then the opportunity to engage our staff in those, or sorry, the public in those projects. Taylor? Other opportunities for partnership and engagement. So reaching outside and trying to figure a way to solutions to some of the issues. A good example was our pandas. Back in 2013, when the pandas were coming to the zoo, we knew we were going to have a waste issue with the volume of bamboo we needed to order in to feed these ones and the amount of bamboo that they weren't actually going to eat. Bamboo is not easily compostable. It takes a long time to compost. So the local solution was landfill, and the Toronto Zoo didn't want that. We reached out to our partners at TRCA, partners in Project Green, local communities, the City of Toronto, and we found a really innovative opportunity to 100% divert the bamboo away from landfill. And that's working with a farmer who was starting up in Holland Landing that wanted to do organic farming. So he wanted to ensure that he was not adding any non-organic material to his system, but he also needed to protect his fields from wind erosion. So working with him, he took all of our waste bamboo and created berms around his fields. And those berms over the next 5 to 10 years are going to protect his fields from wind erosion. Then in 10 years, when the bamboo has actually composted, it provides him with 25,000 tons of organic fertilizer or nutrient-rich soil, which he can then use on his fields to re-nutrize his fields. Next slide. What else can we do in terms of sustainability? So I said we do concentrate on our own facility and trying to reduce our green carbon footprint. But we have a unique feature is we can showcase the different technologies that we use so that the people can understand how these technologies work, the benefits they have for the environment, and the opportunity to see it in action to decide whether or not it's something they can put into place. So we have exhibits where we've actually incorporated different technologies and people see that with signage as well as the mechanics around there. We've got a geothermal field in one of our exhibits that helps benefits the animals and gets them outside in the winter time where previously they had to stay indoors because of our climate. We have pilot projects for a carbon reduced offsetting program with our ice bears, where we're changing the use of electricity from daytime to nighttime in order to run our air conditioners. And what's really new in this area is this year, we're now sending 3,000 tons of organic manure created by the zoo animals to the Zoo Share biodigester at the zoo, which is going to be creating clean, renewable energy for the Ontario electric grid. And when we work at these opportunities, we'll look at how we can showcase them to the public. The Zoo Share biogas facility will eventually be open for tours and school programs. People can see these exhibits and we make the connection on how our exhibits benefit the animals. And we work on reducing our own carbon footprint as well. Next slide. I'm not going to say a whole lot of this one. Taylor, this is actually a video if you click on the polar bears, and it says exactly what I want to say. Can you hear it?
Taylor might have to unmute. That might help.
Okay, this might help. Yeah, I could hear it. That's why. Can you hear it?
No.
My apologies. I take a look at my computer settings really quick and see if I can.
Just to save a little bit of time, I'll summarize this one as well. So when we have the opportunity to showcase different technologies, this is obviously our polar bear exhibit at the Toronto Zoo. In the Tundra Trek, because of the Arctic sea ice issue and the loss of Arctic sea ice with climate change, we have a lot of messaging, and we concentrate our messaging about climate change and renewable energies in the Tundra Trek area. Our polar bear exhibit has a solar PVC panel system on it that's visible to the public, and it runs the fans that are in the Aurora Borealis weather station for the public, as well as the fans inside the polar bear house for the benefit of the polar bears. We can really make the connection with this kind of a showcase directly with the animals. We talk about specifically how climate change is impacting the habitat and the animals themselves, how the technology has been developed and how it works, and then how it's going to benefit, again, that habitat and those animals. So we've had a variety of things that are more biologically based and use nature as its principles for developing. We've got our green roofs. We use wind power, solar power. We're doing a lot of work right now with floating wetlands to improve the waterway that's in there. And we're even changing over media in our filtration systems from something that will allow us to reduce waste over time and reduce the amount of energy that's being used. Next slide. Sorry, it was a cute little video. And finally, for me, something that is very common in the discussion when it comes to mitigating climate change is tree plantings. At the Toronto Zoo, we have over 700 acres that is very much within the Rouge Valley, and we want to help protect the Rouge Valley's biodiversity. So we've been involved in tree plantings at the Toronto Zoo to renaturalize some of the site that we're no longer using, as well as in the local area to help with habitat protection projects for their conservation programs and the local Rouge National Urban Park and help renaturalize that area. But going above and beyond tree plantings, we've also moved into meadow plantings. And this is where we come into pollinator gardens. We come into the butterfly issue for monarchs and trying to increase awareness how benefits those types of plantings are just as important as tree plantings when it comes to protecting biodiversity. So we look at a variety of different ways. We look at internally what our conservation programs are doing and how we can engage our public and our staff in the programs that they're doing by getting them out and active and doing something to help support those other programs. And I'm going to pass it on to Taylor now.
Oh, and I think I'm actually going to pass it on.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Over to me. Hi, everyone. My name is Sean.
Sean, we're having a little bit of trouble hearing you. Can't hear you.
Sean, we heard you at the very beginning, but not afterwards.
Give Sean another minute, and if not, no. No. I guess it's just in the spirit of time, and to give you a second, Sean, if you want, I can go ahead and I can put you back on the end if you want. Okay, let's do that. So I'm just sorry, everybody. I'm just going to quickly fast forward through these to make it a little easier. And I'll give Sean some time to hopefully he can figure out his microphone. So, ani bozo aki nagnanawandam nina indigenous cause amek nindodem wasaksing indonjaba. So I'll just translate what I just said. I said, hello, my name is Aki. That's my Anishinaabe name. My name is Taylor. And I am a member of the Beaver Clan from Wasauksing First Nation. And I thank you very much for being here with me today. So I want to briefly speak about a tour that I designed at the Toronto Zoo. It's called the Seven Grandfather Teachings Tour, and it's the importance, speaks to the importance of Indigenous stewardship. This idea of this tour idea came to me to address the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. And I will touch on those specific calls to action a little bit later in my presentation, but it was a way for the zoo to engage Indigenous and non-Indigenous school-age children in land-based learning. So this tour was built referencing the Ontario curriculum for grades 4 to 7 specifically. And as I said, it's for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students and school groups. So it's, like I said, it's geared for grades 4 to 7, but I do think that the teachings and the lessons that are shared in this tour can be applicable to any age. And so we did, so it is written for that as well. And so just to switch the slide here. So just before I get into the specifics about the tour, I wanted to just go over generally how the 7 grandfather teachings, to do a little introduction. So the 7 grandfather teachings of the Anishinaabe people are listed here, and they're under grandfather teaching in the far right column. And each teaching is a noun. So humility, honesty, wisdom, truth, respect, love, and bravery. And each teaching relates to a specific animal that we would find endemically in Ontario and throughout most of Canada as well. So wolf, in the Anishinaabe name, in Anishinaabe is Maingan. Sabe, which is like a Bigfoot Sasquatch type creature, and Anishinaabe name is Sabe. Beaver, which is Amik, that is my clan, my totem. Turtle, which is Misquadesi. Bison, which is Mashkode Biski. Eagle, which is Migizi, and bear of Makwa. Sorry, I'm just going to switch this just to make my next point. And all these teachings, though independent in the way that they are described, are actually all used as one specific teaching. So that's why they're represented here in a circle. I'm going to just share a story about how these teachings came to be. And so according to the story, long ago, a messenger was sent to see the Anishinaabe people. And he discovered that the Anishinaabe people were living their life in a negative way, which impacted their thoughts, their interactions with one another, their decisions, and their actions. Some had hate in their hearts. Others displayed disrespectful actions, told lies, they cheated. And during this journey, this messenger came across a child. And this child, innocent and as all children are, was chosen to be brought back to the creator and to the 7 grandfathers, and to learn the lessons of how to live a good life. And so this child was taken back to these 7 grandfathers and was taught the lessons of love, wisdom, respect, truth, humility, honesty, and courage. And this child was then taken back by this messenger to the Anishinaabe people and to teach these lessons. But before these grandfathers would let him go, they said to the child that you must remember, and this is why I wanted to show this image here, is that these teachings cannot be used by themselves. You can't have love without wisdom. You can't have respect without truth. You can't have humility without honesty and courage, right? They're all interconnected. And that's a really important theme of these teachings. And so I thought just to, these might be popping up one by one. Sorry about that. And just to give a little excerpt of what this tour would be like, I'm going to share with you one of our first stops. So on the tour, after we leave our meeting spot just outside of our learning and engagement building, you would arrive here at the First Nation Art Garden. Now, this art garden, it was initially designed to be a creation garden to speak to the creation story of the Anishinaabe people, and the Haudenosaunee people, I should say as well. Recently, I've been working to develop a new garden, which is a functional medicine garden that's based off the shape of the medicine wheel, looking to grow cedar, tobacco, sage, and sweetgrass in this garden so that we can use those medicines for ceremony that we conduct at the zoo ourselves. So when we stop at this site, the first teaching that I introduce is the teaching of honesty. Now, I'm not going to quiz you or anything, but when I did introduce this teaching, it actually related to the Sabe, so the Sasquatch being. Now, unfortunately, we don't have any Sabes in any of our exhibits at the zoo, so we decided instead to go with the medicine cedar as a teaching for honesty. And there's a number of reasons for this. Cedar is a very powerful medicine, and we believe in our culture that it can only be picked by a woman, because a woman has only a woman, not a man, has the power to bring new life and new creation into our world. And so because cedar is such a powerful medicine, we only allow females to pick it for us. Once it's picked and been cleaned, males can then use that medicine as well. And so we stop here and we actually do a smudging ceremony with our students. For those who haven't smudged before, you can see that the white sage, which is the top plant on the top right image, and you can see that kind of beige looking, gray looking plant. That's white sage. So we would pick that plant, dry it out, and then we'd burn it in a shell, right, with some tobacco sprinkled on top. And that smoke, we would conduct a little ceremony as we go around in a circle together, right? And there's more to speak. There's more speaking to that. I didn't do too much. I didn't do the ceremony too much justice. But the whole point of that is that we introduce these students to a ceremony, right? And we obviously, if you don't want to take part, you can choose to not partake. But the idea is the smudging grounds all of us. It kind of brings us all on the same page. And the teachings of these seven grandfathers are that we all must kind of be on the same footing to be able to learn these lessons and to carry on this journey. After this one teaching, this honesty teaching is introduced, we travel into our Americas Pavilion, which is adjacent to this, if you have to use your imagination, and we travel through the rest of our animals. So sorry, I'm using the wrong button here. So another section I wanted to highlight that we have present at the zoo is the First Nations Traditional Knowledge Trail. And this Traditional Knowledge Trail isn't actually part of our tour because it's a little isolated from the rest of from the zoo. But this tour touches on the clan system. So if you ever travel through this tour, you'll learn about clan systems, what a clan animal means, and how these animals relate to the conservation work that we do at the Toronto Zoo. So for example, when I introduced myself as Aki and Nagnanawandamnina. I introduced myself as Amek Nindodem. Amek meaning beaver, Nindodem meaning my clan, my representation, my affiliation. And so I am part of the beaver clan. What does that mean? Well, beavers are builders in our communities, right? Cultural and physical builders. So we have a role. It's kind of like a last name being assigned to a clan within our communities. So this trail, even though it doesn't dive too much into the specific, it introduces our guests to these clan systems, how they're applied in Indigenous societies, and how they can relate to the conservation work that we do at the zoo by targeting specific families or specific roles of these clan systems when we work with Indigenous communities. And so now, if you feel free, you can raise your hand if you'd like. You can type a message in the chat if you've ever seen this picture before. If you ever heard of the Three Sisters method of agriculture, it's a Haudenosaunee method of agriculture, and I found this absolutely fascinating. And I'm actually working in the middle of that medicine garden I showed you. I'm working to put a plot of this type of agriculture just to showcase for our guests, and a lot of school children are introduced to this concept as well, just to showcase for them. Sorry. For those who aren't familiar, it's a Haudenosaunee form of agriculture. And basically, the idea here is that you plant a corn stalk. As this corn stalk grows, you plant beans. And the beans grow along this corn stalk. As it grows tall, so do the beans. Beans, most legumes, are nitrogen fixing. So the bacteria present on their roots are nitrogen fixing bacteria, which means that beans help to increase the amount of nitrogen that's in the soil. That in turn increases the crop yield on the corn, the squash, and the beans. And the squash is planted because it's a ground plant that it's really spiky. So if anyone's ever planted squash in their garden, they'll know it's fairly spiky. You got to be careful of those spikes. And it actually prevents rodents and pests from touching or accessing the corn and bean crops. It's a very interesting method of agriculture, and it's unlike our Western methods, which tend to favor monocultures and the use of pesticides and other pest aversion methods. This is a natural method. And I think this is something that goes to show that the knowledge systems of the Indigenous people, specifically the Haudenosaunee communities that developed this, were very in tune with their environments, and that there's a lot to learn from these agricultural systems, not only just in terms of a knowledge base, but also methods that we can learn to apply to our own agricultural systems. Yeah. And so I couldn't give this presentation without touching on truth and reconciliation, especially in conservation. In 2015, Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission presented its findings to the Canadian public, and they published 94 recommendations, or as they called them, calls to action for Canadians to start on reconciliation with Indigenous communities. So at the zoo, we work to include Indigenous views and perspectives throughout our work. And we actually work on about 4 specific calls to action. Those calls are calls 67 to 70, which apply specifically to museums. And they call on museums to increase the amount of Indigenous assets, exhibits, and archival information that they have present on their site. And so we are working to do just that through these tours. We also host something we like to call biofacts at the zoo, which are old animal skulls, animal pelts, and now we're using Indigenous artifacts such as turtle rattles, smudging shells, and different medicines to showcase to the students that we're working with that these artifacts are important, not only for their understanding of these Indigenous cultures, but to understand how these cultures relate to the land that they're standing on. And they're also important to meet these calls for action. And so that when Indigenous people like myself come through as an aspiring biologist or conservationist, we can draw personal connection to this programming and to these exhibits. Oh, my apologies. And so, sorry, I guess it auto switched to a question slide, but yeah. And so that's the I guess that's the gist of my presentation. I'm gonna go back to Sean and see.
All right, let's see if I'm working this time.
You're working, Sean.
Okay.
There we go. So I'm gonna scroll.
Yay!
My apologies for if this hurt anyone's eyes, and over to Sean.
Thanks, Taylor. All right, everyone, let me tell you all about the Natureplay project that I've started at the Toronto Zoo. So as everyone has seen thus far, the zoo is an institution that prizes conservation of the environment and the wildlife that call these spaces home. And we've learned that a healthy land is land that offers us things that we can learn. Now, one of the most fundamental times in every person's life for them to learn is at a young age. And science has shown that as the brain develops, its capacity to learn and to solidify the learned information into long-term memory or behaviors is quite powerful up until we reach maturity, when our brain kind of slows down its growth. After that, the game of learning new tricks gets kind of difficult. That is why, if we wish the future generations to want nature in their world, they need to be immersed in it at a very young age. This is one of the main drivers that has established the Natureplay project at the Toronto Zoo. Next slide, please, Taylor. So for me, it all began in Chicago. In 2014, I had the pleasure of being trained through the Nature Start program that is currently still being offered by the Chicago Zoological Society. And I encourage anyone interested about this program to visit their website. I'm putting it in the chat now, like that. And further to that point, if you're really interested in naturalized play, you'll want to go all the way back to the beginning of the movement and get yourself a copy of Last Child in the Woods, which was written by author Richard Louv. Mr. Louv's writings brought awareness to the fact that our children are spending less and less time in nature, and that this will most likely have a negative impact not only on our future generations, but also on the environment of the future. His solution is very simple: get kids into nature and do it right now. He's also the lead behind the Children in Nature Network as well. So I'm putting a link to that in the chat as well for you to do more research on your own. So this declaration matches very well with the zoo's mission of connecting people, animals, and conservation science to fight extinction. The first step in that connection, of course, is our youth. Since Chicago, the message of Natureplay did not remain solely with me for very long. The first step in the project was to bring the same awareness to all staff and volunteers at the zoo. The next step was to test out the theory. Would play in nature work in a zoo setting? We hosted many pop-up play moments, so temporary play moments throughout the zoo in different seasons, different times, using different materials. What we found were two things. Number one, kids will play no matter what. It is their instinctive method of learning. They can't help themselves. Number two, most parents don't get it. The only time we observe kids not playing is when their own parents told them that they could not or should not. That is why the whole family must be considered when designing play. Next slide, please, Taylor. It isn't simply our mission to connect youth to the nature, which is a way of looking at it from the zoo's point of view, but it seems to also be the unconscious mission of our guests to do the same thing. So the zoo hosts over 1 million guests on average per year. And when we look at the statistics, we see that by far the average guest of the zoo is a family with young children. When we really dig into those numbers, we can see that a full third of those families have children under the age of 4, which is our target when it comes to nature play. So we can see that there are two ideas merging together. The zoo has a desire to bring awareness of the natural world to our guests, and the guests have a desire to expose themselves to the same message the zoo has chosen to deliver. You can see that the zoo takes this to heart, as Kyla has demonstrated, and you learned from Taylor. Nature play is a method of bringing awareness of the natural world too, just in the language of children. Play is how children learn, and during their formative young years, they are as close to a blank slate as we ever are in our entire lives. This means that they're susceptible to any and all messages that are broadcast. So I'm going to try and experiment with everybody, and please follow along if you wish to. I just want you to take a deep breath and relax right now. I want you, if you can, close your eyes and just completely clear your thoughts and only listen to my voice right now. Now I want you to hold out one hand with your palm facing up in the air in front of you. I'm going to put something in your hand. I'm going to describe what it is. Are you ready? I am putting a tarantula in your hand. How do you feel right now? Think about that. You can put things in the chat if you want to. You can put thumbs down, thumbs up, whatever you want, doesn't matter. But everyone had a reaction to that. And it's either a positive reaction or it's a negative reaction. So think about the way you feel and you can do. Can you trace this feeling back into your own past? Some feelings of fear are instinctive, such as the fear of being alone. That's a survival mechanism. But the fear of other animals is more often a learned behavior. Did you know the fear of spiders and snakes are two of the most common phobias known? Are snakes and spiders hell-bent on the destruction of humanity? Of course not. Yet the odds are that humans view snakes and spiders as dangers that must be removed. What about sharks or wolves or bats? The point is, nature is not our enemy or alien to us. We are as much of the natural world as the other animals out there, but we need to make the conscientious decision to include it in our lives. Is such a greater future if our youth learn to respect the natural world rather than fear it. It is the duty of every family member to allow this future to happen, and it is the zoo's objective to give the families the capacity to achieve this. Next slide. So the Natureplay project has a simple goal. Create a suitable amount of space that is specifically designated for the purpose of play. These spaces are to be freely available to all guests. They must provide for the capacity of youth to learn from their play. And upon examining the demographics of the zoo and keeping in mind that the zoo's #1 priority is to provide for our wildlife first, The Natureplay project has set a goal of dedicating 1% of the entire zoo's land to play. That works out to roughly 3 acres of play space. Yet it isn't as simple as having a field or a grove of trees that's just there. There needs to be some guidance as well. And this guidance does not need to be direct, but it can be inferred. Natureplay has the capacity to teach science, art, engineering, and math without formalizing the actual education, as you will see later on in this presentation. By simply adding loose materials to a space and providing minimum facilitation, children will imagine, they will create, they will destroy, they will role play, they will socialize, they will exercise, they will adapt, and my absolute favorite is they will lose themselves in the moment. They become so immersed in nature, and it therefore is infused into their lives. Children learn from nature by being in nature and using nature. The entire time, the family can be there to bear witness and hopefully encourage this as well. The zoo can also help facilitate the facilitators. To do this, the zoo's staff must first be comfortable with Natureplay, of course. Believe it or not, but this was actually the harder task for me to complete. Let's try another experiment for everyone. Deep breath again, relax. And this time I want you to picture yourself wherever it is that you work or in a place that you spend most of your time. If you have an outdoor space that children have access to, in that space, I want you to picture it. Or if you don't, I just want you to picture a public park that is known to you. Now I want you to imagine into that space a very large boulder somewhere in the middle of it. I want you to imagine that there's a sign next to your boulder that reads, "Do not climb." Now I want you to add, with your imagination, children into your space, and one of them is standing on top of the boulder. How do you feel right now? Be honest with yourself how you feel right now. Is your ability to evaluate the risk of this situation accurate? Would you have reacted in a manner that encourages the child to explore nature? The zoo's staff and volunteers are vital to the success of a Natureplay project, and it was a priority to give them awareness of naturalized play so that they are better enabled to facilitate play and the inclusion of nature in the lives of youth, not only in the designated play spaces, but also if they happen to come across it spontaneously anywhere in the zoo. Staff and volunteer awareness will remain a priority for as long as the Natureplay exists in the zoo, and we hope that means forever. Next slide, please. So what does Natureplay look like at Canada's largest zoo? Here's an aerial view of the Toronto Zoo, and included are the spaces that are marked as play spaces and educational spaces currently. These spaces have existed at the zoo for some time. Remember, facilitation of play is not a new idea, and the zoo recognized the need for play from the very beginning. Each new space in the zoo that is created or reimagined incorporates some sort of play aspect. The difference between now and then is that all the spaces you see on this map contain artificial elements, purpose-built for play, yet created by adult minds, viewing the purpose of the play element through an adult perspective. Invariably, when adults build an object for play, they tend to limit the playability of the object. If you aren't sure what that means, just go look at any public park that you can think of that contains structures designated specifically for play. And a good example of this is a teeter-totter. We all can picture what a teeter-totter looks like. The device moves in one direction, back and forth, back and forth. It's bolted in place. It cannot move. It's in that spot alone. It was purpose-built to be used in one specific way. When children begin to use something like a teeter-totter in methods that are not the prescribed method, they're typically asked to stop doing that. They're told, this is not how to use this device. This is not how to play. What could and should happen is the adult should learn from the child. Play is amorphous. It doesn't have definition. It is why you are equally as likely to see children playing in the dirt right next to a teeter-totter as you are to see them playing on the teeter-totter, using the teeter-totter in a way that is prescribed for the teeter-totter. Since, as adults, our ability to play is pretty much atrophied out of our mind, it is in our best interest to figure out the best use of space by learning from the children themselves. The best way to do that is to actually let the space evolve. It's what the zoo is experimenting with now. By designating a space for play, we are telling ourselves that it's okay for children to use this space. By adding loose materials to that space, we're allowing the children in that space to shape and mold it to their own design. By observing their actions, we're learning how the space is going to be used. These observations are then utilized by the zoo to refine the development of the next space. And this is what the conceptual plan for that evolving future may look like. Next slide, please. In addition to the spaces already designated as quotations playable to some degree, the project's goal is to add play into all of the spaces marked in yellow on this map. The cumulative total space of all designated locations will exceed 3 acres in size, which satisfies the main goal of the project of making a minimum of 1% of the land into dedicated space for children to be able to play. In the development of each space, the objective will be achieved by incorporating not only the input of staff, but also the input of families and children. The method used to achieve that is to roll out more play moments. So play moments are temporary portable play spaces in the locations that are identified, and a staff member will remain in or near that space to observe the use of the temporary play option. Children are not given any barriers to play, and it is completely possible for them to use the play elements in any way they choose. This approach allows for the children to do what they do best and use the space in the most opportune way that makes the most sense for the children themselves. Sounds like a risky thing to do, because with the total freedom afforded to children, the materials that are provided to the children can disappear, or the materials could be used to harm the space itself. Yes, risk exists, but it should not cause the full stop of play at any point. From observations done on past play moments at the zoo, both situations did occur. Materials leave and never return. Materials will get used to alter the space. But does that matter? The materials we select were natural materials like pine cones, sticks, pebbles, leaves, bark, whatever you can think of. These natural and renewable materials are not of quotation value, so their movement or destruction is not detrimental. The resources of value in the spaces that are there already were built of materials that could survive the abuse of children. So there were no long-lasting impacts of this. Therefore, by far, the information gathered vastly outweighed the negative impacts. And what have we done with this information so far? Next slide, Taylor. This is what the zoo calls the camel ride space. It hasn't been used for the purpose of camel rides in several years. It was also not designated as a space that would be made into an animal exhibit in the near future. Functionally, it became an abandoned space. So we took advantage of this fact and added a few play moments into it. From the information gathered, we determined that this space was very well suited for play and that it was well suited for naturalized play in specifics. Once approval was received, we committed this space to play, and it is now known as the Eurasia Wilds Play Space. And it features several elements that promote play. The number change that we applied was to minimize, the number one change that we applied, was to minimize the amount of change itself, as you can see in the next image. Next slide. Nature itself has spent decades developing this space for us. With gently sloped hills to flat grassy areas, there's a grove of established poplars, as well as a patch of conifers. There are even several different sized boulders randomly located throughout it. If budget is ever a barrier, then this is the greatest way of adding nature play to a space. All that is required is leniency on the organization's part, your organization, in the use of this space, and to add signage that breaks down the barriers to the families. The signage would invite the use of the space for play, but could also add any warnings and any release from liability that can help to alleviate the anxiety of any members of your organization who are extremely safety conscious. Next slide. So for our space, we chose to add elements, including lots of natural loose materials, as well as a few other elements that aren't as natural. The loose materials were sourced from the surrounding forests of the zoo site. We used branches and logs that had naturally fallen out of the trees or were trees that naturally fell over and made them into play-sized portions. Total cost, nothing. We reused some paving stones that were destined to be thrown away and embedded them into the turf itself to act as stepping stones or a simple labyrinth, as well as making a hopscotch space. Total cost, nothing. We were also able to reuse an old tube slide that was destined to be thrown away, but instead of using it for an actual slide, which meant that we would have to meet the standards set forth for play structures, we chose to actually bury it into the side of a hill and made it into a tunnel instead. And the fact that it's made of play structure grade plastic means that we don't have to worry about the structure failing and injuring children. Total cost, zero. The only manufactured portion was a donation from our own carpenters. They made a weigh scale from scrap wood in their shop. We added, in quotation, gently used, AKA garbage, woven baskets on each end, and the kids, they do whatever they want with it, including measuring things. Total cost, zero. Lastly, we made sure that several picnic tables were added to the space, since wherever kids go, the family will follow, and it is important to make them feel welcomed and comfortable in that space. And the plans are not stopping there. The pandemic may have stalled the initiative, but we expect to get back to work on this project in the near future. The next space has already been designated, and the resources and materials are being sourced right now. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening to this. I hope I inspired anybody listening to think about adding Natureplay to their own organizations. And I think that is when we'll hand it over now for questions, I believe.
It was amazing. I'm going to stop the recording just in case people want to share their questions maybe orally. But thank you so much. I learned so